Howdy, of you delicious people. I am here today to review episode trace of Superman and the Lois. So, we go into here and we ultimately, I would say, a very much heavier story aspect of Superman and Lois, but when looking at it, I'm like, you know what? This was bound to happen, and when also looking at it, I am okay with this episode. Like, I'm okay. It's not like I'm going to start griping about this episode, like, oh my god, I think I'm going to stop watching this show now that it seems like it's more story based for one episode. We do get a event sequence that happens in the very beginning of the episode, which is kind of visually very interesting. And then we also get an action sequence that happens at the end of this episode. But and then everything in the middle is just kind of really going into story. We really have it to where ultimately Clark finally, in within 3 episodes, finally Clark is actually becoming a father to his kids. And he is maybe an overprotective father, but we'll find that out in much more spoilers. And ultimately, that is the one thing that I wanted. I'm like, God, Clark is so like disconnected from his kids. It's redonkulous. But then eventually, within this episode, they create their blah, 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 they end up correcting everything that I just said in the other reviews, where it's like, yeah, Clark is a little disconnected, and then ultimately he gets connected with his sons. So ultimately, bravo on that side. We really have it to where in this episode, it's mostly focused on Jordan and Jonathan through most of this episode, but then eventually we seem to also have Sarah, who is the girl that ultimately Jordan had kissed in this episode, also very much having her seemingly story tie into this episode. We have it to where seemingly that we kind of have some new interesting developments going on with seemingly this story, and it seems that there's kind of a cliffhanger going on towards the tail end of this episode. To be like, what the heck is going on? Like, what is this? Why is this guy? What is any of this? What of it all? What is it all? So, going into the very going into this episode, yeah, story based, yeah, kind of maybe a step back for some people, just like, man, I didn't like this episode as much as the other ones. When looking at it, give it time. Give it time. That's all I have to say. Because when looking at it, it's probably better than a lot of the other CW stuff. It's probably a lot better than any of the, like, for me, like, I really enjoyed Swamp Thing. Even though I don't think there was enough Swamp Thing in that show, and more of like, hey, what's going on with everybody else? So eventually, like, I grew to enjoy the Swamp Thing show, and really towards the tail end of that show, man, did the story actually get really really good. Towards the end there. Um, but anyways, uh, so we end up having to her also, like, I was slightly seeing Lois and maybe Clark maybe differently than I did in the first 2 episodes. Like when looking at both of them, I'm like, do they look a little older compared to the first 2 episodes? Are they trying to like slowly but surely try to age these actors to make them look older on screen, to where ultimately you could buy that they have teen kids or whatever? Like, I don't know. Like, I was just kind of like, maybe that was just my eyes messing with me. But I think that they were kind of slowly but surely trying to age both Lois and Clark to make them look a little bit older. But maybe I'm confused about that. So going on into this episode, we ultimately also tie in Lana Lang again. Like, I don't get what it is with tying in Lana Lang repetitiously into the show. But I guess when looking at it, Smallville did it so repetitively to where basically Clark was basically Lana's like love interest for seemingly the longest time, and then it was ultimately Lex, and then it was kind of the Lex Clark juggle, debacle, whatever. And so, um, but anyways, it doesn't feel like that's happening in the story. Uh, that ultimately Clark is going to be cheating with on Lois with Lana. That's not going to happen. It'd be interesting if that would happen in the story, but it's not. So just to be like, ooh, spicy. So going on into here, this episode, I could be optimistic about it. Other people, what is your reaction upon this episode? Some people might hated it. I just ultimately just said, nah. Like, we got just enough Superman. We got just enough of kind of like, I think they're trying to say that it's like, yeah, this is Superman and Lois, but that's not all the show is going to be about. Interestingly enough, it seems that we are going to have Lois Lane have to kind of adjust the way that she does things to be a part of this Smallville reporting business, which I think is kind of interesting. And so, yeah, let's go into spoiler time about this episode. Let's break it down and ultimately go into what actually happens into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I get to spoil this episode. So, in the very beginning of this, we ultimately have it to where there's a bridge that is end up seemingly collapsing. We end up having it to where pieces are starting to fall and so on and so forth. We end up having it Superman who flies in ultimately to take a big chunk of this bridge to hold it up to, I guess, get people evacuated and so on and so forth. Like, immediately I was thinking it's like, well, if there's a bridge that starts to collapse, why not just have Clark just freeze breath everything, and that might work, maybe. But anyways, so we end up having to where we are to have that interesting action sequence, but then we push on to ultimately have it to where Clark is mostly being a father in this episode, and I can really appreciate it. We end up having to where seemingly that we end up finding out about Clark's super hearing ability. How far of a range does it have? Like, and how good is it? So we end up finding out that Clark can seemingly hear everything going on the planet Earth, and that is how wild his hearing is. And then I'm like, okay, so how does he sleep then? How can a man like that sleep when he's hearing the entire world? Like, does he put like ear things in? Does he like kind of have like noise canceling headphones? Like, what does he do when he's sleeping? Because otherwise I'd just be hearing all kinds of the world just like like, like I don't know, but we end up having to where his sons are ultimately asking him, it's like, well, hey, like, how is it that you can, because he can decipher somebody's voice in distress from any part of the planet Earth. So that is the telltale sign for Superman to jump into action when ultimately he is to hear a girl crying for her kitty, and so Superman flies out there to go and get the kitty and like, here you go. We end up having to ultimately that Jonathan and Jordan ultimately ask Clark, it's like, well, how can you tell the difference between a person uh, like crying for help in agony and somebody yelling at a man for getting his hot dog recipe wrong or something like that? Some kind of like, how can you tell between the anger and upset and the otherwise person? Like, how many times could you have probably made a mistake of flying somewhere where it's not actually somebody that is in real legitimate like distress? Like, what was the ultimate ask him, hey, like, what is the biggest mistake that you have ever made? And we end up having to where Clark ultimately says is like, well, how about I tell you when you guys are older? And so they end up going like, oh, come on, Dad. So we push on. So we end up having to ultimately, uh, Jordan and Jonathan are to go to school, and we eventually end up having to where, of course, the football team, of course, being football team people, are going and giving Jordan and Jonathan a hard time. Ultimately, we end up having to where, of course, the Sarah's boyfriend ultimately is to grab onto Jordan and ultimately just start to intimidate him, ultimately treat him like garbage. And so we end up having to where Jonathan is ultimately trying to protect his brother, and because ultimately Jonathan is like, oh, like, dude, like he could use his powers right here and now, and like this could be awful. And we have it to where Jonathan or to where Jordan is almost clenching his fist. Ultimately, his eyes are starting to turn red, and then we eventually have it to where Clark Kent ends up showing up at the school and saying, "Oh, hey guys, like it's been a while since I've been in this wing of this school. Wow, this looks really nice." And Jonathan and Jordan are like, "What the f, Dad? What's going on, Dad?" We end up having to where ultimately Jonathan and Jordan ultimately ask like their dad. It's like, "Well, hey, why are you here? Like this is the middle of fifth period. Why is it that all of a sudden you're just bizarrely showing up here?" And we end up having to where Clark ultimately says, "Well, I can hear everything." Immediately, we end up having to where Clark is being the most protective dad he can possibly be, and he's immediately assessing that maybe Jordan could be in some kind of danger to where he's tempted to use his power. And so we end up having it to where Clark is eardropping on his kids, and like it's a really good moment because I'm like, yeah, so Clark is actually really being a dad in this episode, and I really like it. Um, but we end up having to where both Jordan and Jonathan are ultimately saying, "Dad, don't snoop on us. Like, come on. Like, if anything, let us be able to handle our lives. Like, don't otherwise micromanage every little thing that we're going to do." Um, so we end up having to where, like, Clark is just like, okay, all right, well, I'll just back off. Like, okay. So we end up having it to where ultimately that when Clark is to back off, we end up having it to where ultimately Jordan ends up deciding to uh, go and go out for the football team. So both Jonathan and Jordan are on the football team, and so we end up having to where Jordan enrolled in or had tried out for the football team because recently Jordan is saying like, dude, all these kids are giving you a hard time. So considering I have powers, I'm going to make it so where they learn a lesson out of this. So we end up having it to where ultimately it seems Jordan uh, has a real power over his powers. Like he has a real handle over his power. It seems like he has the ability to really be able to dial down his power and be able to adjust it to perfectly coincide with everything that is to go on here. And so we end up having it to where Jonathan is like, you know what? I don't know if you should be here because what if somebody gets hurt? What if you get hurt? What if anything could possibly happen to ultimately derail like this whole you being in school, or like you would have to go and move to Tahoe or somewhere and whatever, we'd have to relocate you because you revealed your powers. So we end up having it to where Jordan is like, don't, like, come on, let's let's just play football. Let's just have fun. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Jordan is to line up, I guess, as a defensive guy, and so we end up having it to where ultimately like Jordan is cleaning house. He's ending up like tackling freaking guards and tackles, and those are all football positions, like to the ground, and then ultimately going for the quarterback and sacking the quarterback before he's to get a toss off. We end up having to ultimately like Jordan is like just cleaning house and just taking down guys, tackling them fairly well. For the most point, it kind of looks at some point that uh, sometimes when Jordan is pushing these guys, it looks kind of a little bit too much. Where it's like, man, this guy like really flung this guy, and I was like, yeah, that looks unnatural at some points, but for the most part, it just kind of like it looks really cool. Like it really is really cool to see that Jordan is using his power for good to ultimately teach these kids a lesson to stop harassing his brother. And so that's the thing that I liked about this story is Jordan is kind of teaching these bullies a lesson and doing it on the football field, which is really the right approach to this. So we end up having to eventually that we're ending up on the football field again, and so we end up having to ultimately we have uh, Sarah's boyfriend ultimately going and wanting to uh, try and hit Jordan. So we end up having both of them line up to ultimately smack into one another. And we, of course, have it to where Jordan ends up, of course, just overpowering Sarah's boyfriend and tackling him down. And we end up having to where Jordan ends up apologizing for kissing Sarah because he didn't know that she had a boyfriend, and like it was a bad move on his part. And so ultimately we have it to where Jordan grabs for a hand to help this guy up. And so Sarah's boyfriend could appreciate that ultimately Jordan is like is coming clean and being like is being honest and being straight about things. So you can kind of tell that eventually I guess everybody's probably gonna either get behind Jordan or get behind Jonathan. Either one, they're finally gonna like try and maybe make friends with these people. So all while we have it to where ultimately Clark is not knowing that Jordan is in football. Eventually, he will get to know because eventually Lana will spoil it to him, and then eventually we'll have Clark go onto the field, or not actually on the field, but he'll be in the stands, ultimately watching. Like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. I'm dad. So we end up having it to where ultimately because we end up having it to where there is a diner situation when we have Jordan and Jonathan ultimately going to a diner, and we end up having it to where Sarah is ultimately kind of contemplating her life because she ended up going to cheer practice, and ultimately her mother Lana Lang is ultimately seemingly her coach, and it seems that Sarah is ultimately just kind of done with kind of being a cheerleader. It kind of seems like she is kind of just going through the motions, and like this is more than likely probably what her mother had wanted for her rather than what she probably had really wanted. So we ultimately have to where Sarah is ultimately talking to Jordan and Jonathan and ultimately saying like, you know what, like I honestly think that I want to do something completely different with my life. And we end up having it to where ultimately that it seems that Sarah is kind of coming clean about her family. Because we end up having it to where uh, Sarah ultimately mentions, like, hey, like, haven't you guys ever wanted to just leave everything and start new somewhere else? And ultimately, like, Jordan Jonathan is like, well, that's why we came here. And so ultimately, it seems that like Sarah can connect with Jonathan and Jordan. Like it seems like Sarah is bizarrely coming like best friends with both Jonathan and Jordan, but we're kind of like seeing where exactly this is all going to head. So we end up having to where Sarah is confessing about how bad her life is, how her mother needs pills to be able to go to sleep at night, and her father is a schlub, and all kinds of other things. And so we eventually have it to where Lana is to confront Sarah and ultimately have this big talk out about how like bad their family really and honestly and truly is. And Sarah ends up storming off, and ultimately Clark is to come in at the wrong time, and so eventually Lana is to apologize to Clark later about all the stuff that he might have overheard, and Clark is like, no, no, it's no problem. So we end up having to eventually Sarah and Laura have like a kind of a, a mother daughter talk about things and kind of make amends of all of this. So we end up having to ultimately Clark is to go to the diner and ultimately say like, "Hey, how was your day at school?" We end up having to where Jordan is telling how like amazing Jonathan was in football practice, how like really he was given the 1-2 to everybody, like just kind of like football practice was going great, and we end up having it to where Jordan is talking to Jonathan and ultimately saying, "Dude, why did you lie to Dad? Like, why have you been hiding things from Dad?" And ultimately, like, Jonathan is wanting to. Jonathan is really wanting to come clean about everything, and Jordan is like, can't we just keep some things to ourselves? Like, can't we just kind of like, can we just have our own like thing? So we end up having to eventually Clark and Lana are to have their time together. To ultimately have it to where Clark is to, I guess, give back the loan or sell back to where ultimately he can keep the farm and everything like that. Sign all the paperwork and all that jazz. And so Lana ends up telling Clark about like, well, hey, like we hear how great a star Jordan is on the field. Like, man, is he amazing? Man, is he really like cleaning house? And ultimately, Clark is like, see what now? So we end up having to where Jonathan and Jordan are on the field yet again, and this time around, we end up having Clark in the stands, ultimately going like, yeah. So we end up having it to ultimately that Clark, I think, is fine with both Jonathan and Jordan being on the football field. We have it to where reasonably it seems that like Clark is a little confused because I think having Jordan have such a easy ability to be able to adjust with having powers where Clark didn't, I think is making Clark way more cautious than he should be about things. Because really, Jordan is just like, dude, I got this superpower thing down. Where Clark is just like, well, I don't think you do, but well, maybe I'll just kind of I'll give you your space. So we end up having to ultimately that Clark ultimately in this timeline had never tried out for the football team, which I'm like, oh, okay, so that's interesting. So in Smallville, we ultimately had a tour. We had a Clark that ultimately had been a quarterback. Where in this story, we end up having a Superman that hadn't tried out for the football team at all. So again, that is to really showcase us like how the main reason why Clark is really cautious compared to another Superman that would have won and just said like, yeah, hey, do whatever you want as long as you just don't release your power to anybody. But so we end up having to where reasonably Clark's fine about this, so we end up having to where reasonably he says like, well, like, do you want to play football? And ultimately Jordan was like, well, yeah. At first, I was just kind of like teaching these guys a lesson, but then after that, I kind of really enjoyed it, and so we end up having to where like Clark says, okay, uh, I'm willing to go and have you do football as long as I'm the assistant coach. And so we end up having to where Clark desperately asks the coach of the football team to be an assistant coach. And we end up having to where Lana Lang or Lois Lane ends up coming in and saying, yeah, he'll do it for free. And the head coach is like, sure, yeah, here, like, yeah, if you're gonna do it for free, sure, I'll have you do the job. So we end up having to where Clark is to do the assistant coaching job, and I'm kind of confused because I'm like, well, is this going to affect his Superman abilities? Is he going to jerk his job and whatever? Is he ultimately going to just complain that it's a job that he doesn't get paid for, so he can kind of like get his way out of it? Maybe call in sick when his kids are winning a game and whatever, and they have nothing to share with their father. That could be some interesting story moments. So we ultimately end up having to where Clark is to uh, go with the kids to one of their football games, and it seems that ultimately, like Clark is to end up look like he's having issues trying to get one of the jugs of water, and eventually we have to where Clark says it's like, well, hey, how about you pretend to look like you're struggling to like bring this into the vehicle with me or into the bus with me. And I think that that was such a nice moment told me have it to where they're like pretending that these things are heavy because they're supermen basically. So now we have to push on to the action moment of this episode. So we end up having to where Lois is to end up being shoved with doing a fluff piece for her Smallville reporting job. And so we end up having to where Lois is like, dude, I don't do fluff pieces. And we end up having it to where her boss is ultimately just saying like, well, that's what you have to do now. You have to do any kind of different kind of news to ultimately just kind of cover things. Like it'll be interesting to see how Lois adjusts to this job because of how like really just small the roster is and any number of things. So we end up having a woman coming in to ultimately saying like, hey, is there a woman that ultimately had done some article of sorts? And so ultimately Lois Lane is like, yeah, that's me. And so we end up having it to where Lois is ultimately thrusted into a story that is to otherwise tie the guy who had played Colossus on the X-Men movies. Uh, we ultimately have it to where this guy is supposedly called Subject 11. Subject with a K. And so we end up finding out that I guess that Lois is tied to this woman that is otherwise going to seemingly get um, injured and hurt by this Subject 11. And so we end up having to ultimately. Superman is to end up going in and trying to take down this Subject 11. And ultimately, we end up seeing him do some very interesting things here with this action sequence. We end up having it to where at some point we have Superman freezing Subject 11 just to punch him in the face to ultimately have him just try to beat up this guy more. And I'm like, wow, like, what a different approach to a fighting style than we've seen previously in anything. Like, I'm just like, man, I'm really enjoying this kind of Superman that basically we can have a Superman that almost kind of does anything, and I'm really liking this approach. Like it feels like this show has more money than any of the other shows, or just a better way of approaching things. So we end up having to ultimately, like, we have Superman who froze this guy just to punch him, and I was like, well, what if you just froze the guy and he just was there? But anyways, uh, but I thought it was kind of like really a cool effect to like punch the guy and just kind of try to take him out as much as humanly possible. We eventually have to where Superman just takes this guy out to have him ultimately run off, to drive away, and try to get away from Superman. We ultimately run him off. So we end up having to ultimately Superman is to go and grab the woman that is seemingly very hurt and ultimately take her, fly her off to the hospital. Um, and we ultimately have to where Subject 11 is to be driving and calling somebody to ultimately seemingly have, I guess, what we are to assume a real Kryptonian heat vision their way through this windshield to kill Subject 11 and then walk off. I'm like, okay, so is this Mercy? Is this someone else? Who is this exactly? Who is this mysterious Kryptonian possible person? Um, could this be an alternate variation of some other character that we're not quite familiar with? Who knows? Um, I was kind of baffled about the whole Subject 11 thing, um, but I just really appreciated the sequence, the fighting sequences. There was really some interesting things going on as far as fighting was going on in there. But other than that, that's all I had to say about this episode. I'm gonna get out of here so ultimately I can kind of squeeze in and I'm trying to get this video as short as possible. So goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.